travaille à l'université Ahmadou Bamba, en l'occurrence le professeur Ibrahim Tchou, qui me disait, Ousmane, c'est l'une des rares fois où j'entends parler de Mustafawiyya au Sénégal, et n'eût été le Magal, je serais certainement venu. Et tout de suite, je l'ai désigné comme maintenant, plutôt que professeur, il est maintenant Djewri. Voilà, un Djewri. Donc, j'avais promis de m'asseoir ici pour quelques minutes, histoire de vous présenter quelqu'un que vous connaissez déjà, parce que Felwine, c'est ce qu'on appelle en anglais un household name. Tout le monde a fini d'entendre ce nom, Felwine. Felwine, je crois que c'est Felwine Mamadou Sarr. Voilà. Alors, Felwine Mamadou Sarr, je reviendrai là-dessus. Felwine Mamadou Sarr, et c'est autre chose. Mais Felwine est universitaire sénégalais, écrivain et musicien. Ça c'est les esprits d'une certaine période de l'évolution des lettres en Europe, cet éclectisme, un homme parfait, un homme du monde qui touche à beaucoup de domaines pour se compléter. On est musicien, on est romancier, on est essayiste, on est professeur et critique. C'est extrêmement important. Il est professeur titulaire des universités à l'Université Gaston Berger de Saint-Louis au Sénégal, agrégé en économie, et Anne-Marie Bryan, distinguished professeur d'études romanes et africaines à l'Université de Duke en Caroline du Nord. Alors là aussi, il y a une sorte d'anecdote. Je le retrouve à l'hôtel qui s'appelle maintenant Moon. Je crois que c'était là-bas que lui. Avec le même port. Si vous voyez Felwine, c'est quelqu'un qui est toujours en chemise. Chemise blanche le plus souvent ou chemise bleu clair. Rarement il met autre chose, sauf s'il y a des circonstances particulières pour le protocole, ou s'il veut éviter de se faire tuer par l'hiver et le froid de la Caroline du Nord que j'ai visité. Donc voilà, et je lui dis, mais Felwine, avec votre profil-là, si vous mettiez un peu en plus du français l'anglais, il me dit, je parle l'anglais, je l'écris. Et d'ailleurs, je suis à Douk. J'ai dit, bon, c'est moi qui n'étais pas informé. Donc, à nouveau, ce côté complet. Ces travaux académiques portent sur l'économie, la philosophie contemporaine africaine et l'épistémologie. Il est l'auteur d'essais, de romans, de nouvelles et de pièces de théâtre. Il a publié à ce jour Dahij, à Gallimard 2009, 105 rue Carnot, Mémoire d'Ancrier, Médiation africaine, toujours Mémoire d'Ancrier, Afrotopia, je crois que c'est l'une des dernières publications, Ishin d'Enshin, Habiter le monde, Écrire l'Afrique monde, voilà, co-dirigé avec Achille Mbembe, Philippe Ray Jimsan. Jimsan, c'est la maison d'édition qu'il a avec Boubacar Boris Diop. Il coécrit avec Bénédicte Savoy le rapport sur la restitution du patrimoine africain, spolié à l'Afrique tirant l'époque coloniale, qui sera publié sous le titre Restituer le patrimoine africain. Il publie en 2019 Politique des temps, ouvrage collectif issu des ateliers de la pensée de Dakar, co-dirigé avec Achille Mbembe, Philippe Rey, La saveur des derniers maîtres, Trace acte sud 2001 traduit en Wolof sous le titre de Watif par Youssef Carter. Il a écrit aussi L'économie à venir et les liens de Kabyle mes rêves, le bouddhisme est né à Koloban. C'est intéressant, j'utilise ça. Le bouddhisme est né à Koloban. La fabrique du présent, ça, voilà, une collection de ce qu'il a écrit. Mais ce que je voudrais ajouter, et que peut-être vous avez oublié et ou que vous ne connaissez pas, c'est qu'il y avait une émission extrêmement célèbre sur la radio-télévision et la télévision de la RTS. C'était tous les jours, surtout pendant les vacances, les dimanches, avec un journaliste émérite qui s'appelle toujours Martin Faye. Et Martin Faye est connu pour son émission phare à la télé qui s'appelait Génie en herbe. Et Génie en herbe mettait en scène des élèves de première, peut-être terminale, et ils étaient là à se soumettre à des questions et des devinettes pour qu'on puisse mesurer le niveau de leur connaissance. Alors, c'est là où j'ai retenu le nom de ce jeune homme qui s'appelait Felwine Sarr. C'est pour ça que quand je l'ai vu des années après, en tant que professeur à l'UCP, je lui ai posé la question, je lui ai dit, mais vous là, vous, quel est votre rapport avec Felwine Sarr de Martin Faye? Il sourit d'un sourire très timide et il me dit, c'est moi. Et à l'époque, tous les dimanches, vous étiez sûr d'avoir Felwine qui est là et qui répondait à toutes les questions quand les autres élèves étaient incapables de donner les réponses. C'est là où j'ai retenu le nom de Felwine Sarr. Mais ce qu'il y a aussi, c'est que Felwine, ça a un sens. Ça a absolument ce que vous appelez un meaning. Et ça ne s'écrit pas comme nos gens de l'état civil l'ont écrit. Le I est géminé. On aurait dû écrire Felwine. F-E-L-W-I-I-N et sans E. Parce que Felwine, c'est du sérère. Ça n'a rien à voir avec l'église, ça n'a rien à voir avec la mosquée, ça n'a rien à voir avec le français ou le wolof, c'est Felwine. Littéralement, celui que les hommes, que l'humanité, que les humains aiment. Cette façon de nommer chez nous, vous nommez par évitement ou vous nommez par souhait. Diegan, celui qui n'appartient à personne. Mossan, c'est celle qui est belle. Parce que Mos, à Mossa, en serré, ça veut dire elle est belle. Dieu, c'est sa propriété, être le propriétaire de Diegan. Eh bien, you know, you are nobody's slave or you are nobody's property. Donc, Felwine, you know, c'est celui qui est aimé. Je ne veux pas dire celui qui plaît aux hommes ou aux femmes, parce qu'à partir de ce moment, il y a d'autres spéculations. Mais celui que les humains aiment bien. Donc, vous faites, avant même d'être célèbre, votre nom vous proclamez comme quelqu'un qui serait connu de tous. Hein? Et ça, c'est bien le sérère. Et remarquez d'ailleurs que chez les sérères, c'est tout, les catholiques, on n'a jamais le nom de l'Église tout seul. Il y a toujours, à côté du nom européen, you know, Jean, Louis, il y a un autre nom sérère. Léopold Sédar Senghor. Sédar, moi, il a ramené un gâtier. Celui qui n'aura jamais honte devant les autres. Parce que Sédar, ça veut dire j'ai honte. Sédar, c'est le négatif. Il aura toujours la tête haute. Vous avez toujours donc le nom de l'église, Léopold, plus le nom traditionnel qui est toujours une sorte de wish. Voilà. Et je suis très content de cette approche sereine qui veut garder la tradition. Donc, le monsieur qui était l'instant de Génie en herbe s'appelle véritablement Felwine Sarr. Et Felwine, nous sommes très heureux de t'accueillir ici en compagnie de Youssef autour de la thématique de Vast Oceans. Je crois que mon travail s'arrête là. Je vous libère la table et je vais mettre quelque part à l'ailleurs. Merci beaucoup d'être venu. Merci. Donc,
we're just speaking English. As you said, he's an Anglophone guy, a wonderful from the beats, but at the front of the room. And if there are questions in French for him, I just them. And sometimes there is switch in French. So, and I'm sure the audience is fluent in English. So,
Je vois que beaucoup, ils connaissent tous presque l'anglais. Hein. Est-ce qu'il y en a qui ne parlent pas anglais dans il y en a un. Donc, Felwine, peut-être quelque part, vous êtes un peu sûr. Voilà.
wow, tu as tous ces tu français, quoi. Mais la plupart, je pense que le potentiel anglophone, et Youssef est anglophone. So, c'est peut-être tout ce for here. But yes.
Yeah, I think you're best to switch between one of you, I think.
So, thank you, et merci. Beaucoup sur ce bassin, c'est Youssef Carter, donc je ne fallait pas vous présenter aussi longuement. Donc, mais en tout cas, merci pour la générosité des propos. So, I start by thanking you, Youssef Carter, for his invitation to be in conversation with him around his book. But also thanking Usman Sarr and all his team for hosting us generously here at the WARC for the conversation. We're very pleased to see everyone in the audience and acknowledge your presence here. So Youssef Carter is an assistant professor of religious studies and a Kenan Griffith Fellow in Islamic Studies at the University of North Carolina at the Czech Republic. So he teaches a lot of classes. So I would say some of them regional and global justice, Islam and Black global South, Muhammad and the Quran, as well as classes on Sufism. He also served as faculty advisor for the Muslim Student Association and the Black Muslim Collective. But mainly his scholarship centers on Muslim life and networks in the Black Atlantic, and primarily interest in religious empowerment. So Youssef Carter has recently published at UNC Press in June 2020, The Vast Oceans, Remembering Allah and Self, on the Mustafawiyya Sufi path. I will start by some remarks around the book before engaging a conversation with him and letting him the floor, and after that we open the floor to the So the Vast Ocean traces how the Mustafawiyya, a West African Sufi path founded by Sheikh Muhammad Mustafawiyya, take root and flourish in the Black Atlantic, with a particular focus on monks corner in South Carolina and ongoing ties to Senegal and the wider Khmer diaspora. At the center of the book is the life, teaching, and care ethic of Sheikh Harun Rashid Faye, whose spiritual leadership and companionship and tireless services shape a transnational community of devotion and healing. Youssef Carter, I was hesitating to use the word ethnography, but I changed the word to an intellectual and a spiritual presence and close attention to devotional practice, argue in the book that zikr, remembrance, solidarity, discipline, self-cultivation, the tazkiyah, and other spiritual practice offer Black Muslims resources to confront historical and contemporary anti-Blackness while building durable forms of belonging. Youssef Carter situated this movement within the Islamic civilization and Muslims network, and these movements are relational, mobile, and are shared by exchange. The community in South Carolina, more than a trusted institution, is a living ecology of care, moving across spaces, languages, Arabic, all of English, moving across rituals and kinship bonds. And again, the narrative that imagines Black Islam through a narrow lens, the book restores West African Sufi authority, aesthetics, and pedagogy to the center of a contemporary Black Muslim experience. From a methodological point of view, a strong aspect of the book is how Youssef Carter has been able, to my sense, to be able to articulate his intellectual journey in his spiritual practice. Carter writes as an ethnographer, in brackets, but an ethnographer formed by the community he studies, attentive to reciprocity, consent, and the ethic of representation. And the work of Youssef Carter bridged Islamic studies, religious studies, I can say anthropology with an ethic of presence and gratitude. And what also strikes me in the methodological avenue of Youssef is what I would call the methodological humility of the book. The book acknowledged editorial exploring interlocutors, but centered to Fukara, the disciples, whose stories make its argument. From the many important contributions of the books, I will highlight some of them. One of the contributions is spiritual care as resistance. So the Mustafawiyya practice can cultivate inner steadiness and collective dignity that enable disciples to face anti-blackness without reducing their personhood to suffering. Youssef Carter suggests that Zikr, remembrance, is not escapism, but training for clarity, patience, and action based on principle. And for him also, Zikr is a spiritual exercise, but also a social technology. And for him, Hikmah is a piety and an infrastructure. Music is theological and pedagogy. Here, the Sufi authority appears as a caregiving competence. The chef legitimacy flows from the services, availability, and the capacity to heal, not from distant charisma. And this refrain Islamic leadership in contemporary diasporas. But another point I want to highlight is what I will call the diasporic consciousness. The book map and remap Black Muslims belonging through Senegal, Thiès, Montcalm. And here Montcalm is not provincial but central in relation to Senegalese lineage, where being at home, due to the practice of Ziyara, being at home means being on the route, being traveling. And Ziyara and Baya teach what I recall a portable homeland of practice. And why this book is important and matter now, in a moment of racialized precarity, spiritual exhaustion, the vast ocean offered an account of Black Muslim life, where healing and rigor coexist. It shows how small southern towns can be engine of transnational religious creativity, how West African Sufism continue to see futures in the Americas. The books also complicate the binarity such as sacred and secular, Africa/America, private republic, and the collective. The book also resists both reductive identities, frames, and superficial wellness. It advocates for a demanding but a beautiful path where Zikr, remembrance, reorder desire, services, binds neighbors, and artistry tutors the soul. Its argument is that community of Zikr and Hikmah produce people capable of enduring with grace and acting with mercy. And I'll also point to the architecture of the book. It is a pedagogical and devotional one. The title of the chapters are Mustafawiyya's practice. Each practice is a doorway into a specific spiritual path and its social effects. So we have a chapter on Baya, solar pledge, on Zikr, remembrance, on Ziyara, participation, on Hikmah, the services, on Taskia, the spiritual refinement, and at the end on Shiva, the healing. So, to give the floor to it, also I will start with one question. My first question will be, Youssef, can you tell us more about the context of the writing of the book? And how have you been able to articulate your intellectual and spiritual journey to this book? So the floor is yours.
So I actually went to so Assalamu alaikum warahmatullah wabarakatuh, everyone. Thank you for being here. Thank you, Professor Felwine Sarr. The unique, the exceptional, the celebrity in the room. MashaAllah. Thank you, Professor Usman, all of the staff at West African Research Center, which is an institution of exception in Dakar, in West Africa, actually. So thank you so much for honoring me with the opportunity to share this work, this offering to the public, in this sort of such a dignified forum. So it's no small thing to me. And I don't take that lightly. So once again, thank you for that. And so instead of answering that question directly, I wanted to sort of share some things first for a little bit, just sort of get those of us who are less familiar with my work grounded as we talk about what is in the book. So I wanted to acknowledge something first. So on the 14th of July, those who are a part of the community, the Mustafawiyya, and those who are admirers of Sheikh Qur'an who is responsible for bringing the Mustafawiyya Tariqa Sufi movement outside of West Africa from the 1990s onward, passed away last year in 2025 in July 14th. And so this past July 14th, the community, his admirers, his students, his family commemorated his transition. And so as I sort of talk about that, I want to open with a story that he shared with me back in, I believe it was 2014. So if you'll permit me. And once again, let me apologize for being the English speaker in a predominantly Wolof and French speaking environment. So sorry. I can speak some Wolof, but it's mostly restaurant Wolof, monastery Wolof, Mexican Wolof, you know, but not academic Wolof. The same with French to a lesser extent. I chose to actually study Wolof as opposed to French. And so for all of my talk of decolonization and whatnot, here we are. We're on a journey. All right. So the story I want to share with you, actually, that was told to me and others by the Sheikh back in, more than a decade ago. I opened with the last chapter of this book, and so I'll talk about it in a moment. But let me sort of just go ahead and read it. And so this particular story is about one of Sheikh's distant ancestors, and it takes place in Mauritania. All of the story is told in South Carolina. Abdullah, a young Mauritanian boy of about 12 years old, was walking home toward his village and saw some white men coming toward him. They stopped him to ask him some questions and decided to capture him in order to sell him into slavery. He quickly learned of their intentions and reported that he would not go with them as he was headed back home. In spite of their desire to enslave him, they did not understand that this was the son of a wali, a powerful and knowledgeable sheikh. Even though Abdullah was relatively young, by this point he had learned the Quran in its entirety and was the recipient of sacred knowledge that made him more powerful than one might assume. The slavers saw only that he was a helpless boy as they rushed toward him and intended to pull him into their ugly trade. They bound his hands with rope and continued on their route with Abdullah now in tow. As they marched toward him toward a terrible fate, he picked up some sand and recited a prayer derived from the verses of the Quran where God spoke of changing hypocrites into apes of days. Upon reciting this prayer, he blew into the sand and proceeded to throw it onto his capturers' heads. They immediately transformed into large white dogs. The unfortunate quartet barked incessantly as they jumped up and down in protest of what Abdullah had done to them. Pleased with himself, he triumphantly unbound his hands and headed toward his home, but the dogs followed him. The strange companions came upon another group of white men who remarked to the small boy about the impressive dogs that accompanied him. Where did you get these nice, beautiful dogs? They asked him. He replied, oh, you want them? Yes, we will buy them from you. Abdullah dared not reveal how he came to be in the company of these dogs. He said, give me one gold coin for each. The foreigners bought the pack of dogs from Abdullah and he accepted the gold coins from his customers. The dogs, understandably, refused to follow the other group of white men because they knew that their fate now rested in Abdullah's hands. The possibility of their being transformed back into their former selves depended upon the young boy they previously tried to enslave. However, the group apprehended their defiant property, and Abdullah went home proud. Now, upon his arrival, he did not share all of what happened that day with his father, Shamsuddin, for fear of how he would respond. So he hid his gold under the pillow where he slept. That evening, faint barking noises began to erupt from somewhere in the house, and Abdullah's father quickly jumped up. He asked his son, "What is that noise?" "I hear dogs barking." Abdullah replied that he had heard nothing. His confused father laid back down to rest. The barking continued again a bit more loudly and woke up the old sage once more. Again, he questioned Abdullah about the barking as Abdullah nervously denied any knowledge about what his father heard. He lay back down only to be roused suddenly by the undeniable sound of muffled barking from somewhere in the house. This time, the father demanded that Abdullah get up and explain to him where the noise came from, as he suspected that his son was not entirely forthcoming. At this point, Abdullah could no longer deny what happened. He revealed to his father the coins under his pillow and explained how he got them. Abdullah opened up the carefully wrapped coins, and the bewildered pair witnessed the coins jumping up and down and barking as if they were actually dogs. How strange. The old wali warned his son that he needed to throw the money away and to be mindful about using the things he was taught only for good purposes. He reminded Abdullah that whenever something like that occurs, he should be informed immediately. His father reminded his son that he could not hide such things from him, as it was he who had earned the power of vision from God. Now, although that story was told to me, and a group of us actually, about 12 years ago, this story was told in the mosque in Monk's Corner. The name of the masjid is called Muhajir Mullah Ansar. And the sheikh at the time didn't necessarily explain why he told the story, but after some reflection, I gathered that the point of the story is that an understanding of the Quran might very well wind up saving your life and your lineage. Now, what I attempt to sort of think through in the book that I've written is not just, it's more than just, a kind of ethnographic unfolding, as Professor Melvin mentioned, an ethnographic unfolding of this sort of Black Muslim devotional Muslim community, in order to sort of reflect on a collection of devotions and rituals and whatnot. I'm also in time to think about how there's an inherent politics there. And so it is not for nothing, as you said, that this story was told in front of a group of his students who are primarily Black. And when I say Black, I mean that capaciously. I mean that in an expansive sense. That includes people who were West African as well as Black American Muslims being told this particular story in a masjid that was founded and built on land where the ancestors of many of those people sitting there were likely enslaved, right? And so we're talking about Monk's Corner, South Carolina, right? And so I will say again, that masjid sits on land that was formerly a plantation, where people who look just like them were enslaved 170 years prior, right? And so there's an inherent politics there. And so again, it's not just for nothing that this was told, right? The sheikh was trying to teach something. And so the tariqa was founded in 1966 by Sheikh Mohammed Mustafawiyya in Chess, Senegal, where he was born. As you can see here, is on the right is a picture of the sheikh. He was born in 1926, passed away in 1989 at the age of 63. Very much like the Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. Okay. And so I want to skip ahead quickly and share something else with you. As I sort of try to bring together these questions of spirituality and politics, one of the things that one of the interventions I try to make in the book, which is entitled The Vast Oceans. I feel like I should talk about the title. And so I picked the name The Vast Oceans in honor of a qasida that was written by Sheikh Mustafa called Al-Bahr al-Muhit, The Vast Ocean. And so it's a commemoration, it's a celebration of the maqams, of the stations of Prophet Muhammad, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so in it, it provides those who read it with an intimate understanding of the understanding that the Sheikh Mustafa has with the Prophet Muhammad, because after all, he's able to found this tariqah based on his sort of encounters with the Prophet. He gives him a salatu, right? Called salatu Samawiyya, right? And so, which I can talk about that later. But I also use the vast oceans, or the ocean actually, as a metaphor to talk about three things, right? So one, it's an opportunity to think about tasawwuf and Islam more broadly in West African context as an ocean, right? The depths of which we do not know. I argue that that ocean has the capacity to tell us something very important about the human, right? Because many of the people who found Sufi movements like the one I discussed, as well as the Tijaniya, the Nuridiyya, the Dayan, etc., are all doing something important, right? The Qadariyya, they're all doing something important, right? This is not just a matter of trying to sort of devise a mechanism for people to come together and pray together, right? One of the reasons, and I'm just saying this because this is the one of the sort of arguments I make in the book, is that, you know, that the particular, I don't say brand, flavor or texture or presence, I like the word presence, of the South as it erupts in Senegal takes on a particularly decolonial shape, right? And so in so far as in the sort of social sciences and the humanities, right, in the academy more broadly, there's the questions of the human, right? And so I argue that this sort of ocean mingles its waters with another ocean, right, with centuries of Black suffering, but then also triumph, movement, etc., the depths of which we do not know, and that is the Atlantic, or in other words, the Black Atlantic. That these oceans together have the capacity to have impact on a third ocean, the depths of which we do not know, which is the heart, right? So all these things are sort of wrapped together, and that the qasidas or the qasa'id that are written by Sheikh Mustafa and others like him, I use the term oceans in the plural sense for a reason, because the idea is not to identify the Mustafawiyya Sufi path as necessarily exceptional and alone by itself, but rather in conversation with other movements like it, right? And so we should understand the qasa'id of Sheikh Mustafa as technologies of remembrance, technologies through which a certain manner of being and becoming can be sort of activated, right? That is sort of emancipatory in nature. And allow us to sort of think and act and be capaciously. So I wanted to give you an example of what I mean here in terms of like reading differently, right? These writings. So this is a qasida that was written by Sheikh Mustafa called Maqam al-Qadshib, which was written by the Sheikh earlier in his life, in which he is, it's essentially a prayer in which he tries to, he wants to understand who the Prophet is, not through biography, but through the Prophet himself. And so I'm going to share a little bit of that with you. And so in that particular qasida, which is written in Arabic, that's performed by practitioners, fuqara, in West Africa, Senegal included, as well as the United States, as well as in Cordoba in Spain, as well as Indonesia. In the translation reads as follows: Allah unveils unveiling with light. As you are the unveiler, remove my veil. Allah shows us kindness, being eternally gracious. As you are the kind one, grant my du'as with your generosity. Allah grants us aid, extending his help openly. You are the helper, help with my remedy. Allah preserves, protecting everything. You are the protector, protect my physical being. Right? Allah draws near, bringing about benefit. You are the causative factor. Bring wealth toward me. Allah imparts knowledge, bringing about understanding. You are the grantor of understanding. Let me comprehend my meaning with you. Allah gives expansion, extending his benefits. You are the one with open hands. Expand my contentment. Allah deals with his creation, applying the truth. Since you are the cause of all things, bring about your gifts to me. Allah heals imperceptibly, restoring the health. Since you are the healer, cure my debility. So this sort of language of healing, this language of protection, this language of unveiling, I want us to sort of table that or like keep that in our minds as I move to the next slide. And so what does it mean for people of African descent who historically, presently are dealing with conditions of grappling with sort of ideologies of race, but then also dealing with the sort of historical trauma of enslavement, but then also colonialism, right? And the sort of dehumanizing impacts of that, right? So if we think about 1903 at the turn of the 20th century, what I just shared with you sits, I think, quite interestingly with W.E.B. Du Bois's The Souls of Black Folk, in which he talks about unveiling as well, right? Du Bois in 1903 writes the following. He says, the Negro is a sort of seventh son, born with a veil and gifted with second sight in this American world. A world which yields him no true self-consciousness, but only lets him see himself through the revelation of another world. It is a peculiar sensation, right? This double consciousness, the sense of always looking at oneself through the eyes of others, of measuring one by the tape of a world that looks on in amused contempt and pity. One ever feels his two-ness, an American, a Negro, two thoughts, two unreconciled strivings, two warring ideals, one dark body whose dogged strength alone keeps it from being torn asunder. The history of the American Negro is the history of the striker, this longing to attain self-conscious manhood, to merge his double self into a better and truer self. So it's a lot of things to say here, right? So I'm going to try to sort of wrap this up tightly if I can. But the one, right? So the idea that people would be committed, people of African descent, Black people, who are Muslim, would be committed to a life, a journey of self-improvement, of spiritual excellence, etc. In the context of an environment that communicates unremittingly the idea that somehow people of African descent are of lesser kind of humanity, right? Is not for no reason, right? That there's a sort of politics inherent in that. So one of the things that I'm trying to do with this book is to say that what does the South do in the hands of people of African descent, right? That this is not just a matter of religion and spirituality, that spirituality actually is never not political, right? Because spirit, in terms of how we understand the spirit in the human, in sort of the human experience, is always affixed to the body, right? And that remains the case until, right, you transition to this world. Furthermore, a human being properly understood as both spirit and flesh. And so as Du Bois is writing this in 1903, he's trying to sort of communicate, really sort of get to the bottom of what ails the human, right? And it's, according to him, the problem of what he called the problem of the color line. That this will be the problem of the 20th century, writing in 1903. And lo and behold, it is also the problem of the 21st century, right? And so it is as if this book could have been written in 2003 or 2023, hopefully not 2053, right? But who knows? So anyway, Sheikh Al-Nafai, the protege of Sheikh Mustafa, right? In the mid-1990s, travels across the Atlantic, bringing this message of the Mustafawiyya, the Sufi movement, across the Atlantic into South Carolina upon marrying an African-American Muslim named Aisha. And together they would birth Zambia, or this community, this Muslim community of Moncks Corner. And so they would name this community Masjid Muhajir al-Ansar, right? And so in Moncks Corner is about 30 to 40 driving, 30 to 40 minutes driving northwest of Charleston. So anybody who knows anything about Charleston, South Carolina, is one of the most important and significant ports of entry for enslaved people in what is now the United States, right? And so again, it is not for no reason, or I should say, it is significant that this community of people of African descent are worshiping on land, embodying a kind of spiritual autonomy, traveling freely in this place when 170 years prior, they would not have been able to do so. Instead of people, they would have been considered property, right? It's also a little mapping here of South Carolina. It's kind of, for those of you that are sitting a little bit closer, you can kind of see Moncks Corner. And by the way, this is not the only community of people of African descent who have built a spiritually nourishing, politically sort of illuminating community. For those of you that are not aware, there's a community that was sort of comes together actually 20 to 25 years before this community was established in Beaufort, South Carolina, which is called Oyatuji Village, right? Which is, you know, the people who are part of the sort of Ifa tradition, primarily African Americans who build this sort of West African village in South Carolina and view themselves as entirely and wholly separate from the United States. And so while the Muslims of Moncks Corner don't necessarily see themselves as separate from the United States, what you effectively see is a space of spiritual autonomy, right? A space of spiritual and religious nourishment, right? A space where you can come and feel cared for and be cared for, right? Where you will run into, you know, Black American Southern slang, where you will run into people speaking in a kind of Gullah Ishi accent, as well as people speaking Wolof in Arabic in this space where if you on other Friday or Sundays, when people come together and sort of bring the food from home to feed each other, you will eat candied yams and cornbread and fried chicken, all alongside jagojen and chicken yassa, right? And bisa. So I wanted to sort of shift really quickly to kind of talk about the architecture of the book. And this is how I sort of see myself as not engaging in an anthropology per se, but rather what others would call a Black anthropology, right? And so if somebody asks me, are you an anthropologist? I'll say, no. I identify as a Black anthropologist, and I see that as a different trajectory of thought, a different trajectory of study, a different trajectory of an appendage of Black study, right? Which, and the distinction is anthropology as a discipline begins as a colonial mechanism, right? And arguably perhaps still is in certain ways. Whereas Black anthropology, right, is sort of founded upon a principle of sort of, I guess you could say, an intellectual pursuit that is very much tethered to the political project of abolition, right? And so for me, I see this as a kind of a reflection that is informed by Black studies, specifically Black Muslim study, and I talk about that in the last chapter. And so in terms of the architecture of the book, let me sort of land this plane so that we can converse. The architecture of the book, I sort of talk about the community of Mustafawiyya that spans both South Carolina and Senegal, through a number of different concepts that are general concepts that you'll find through, Islamic discourse, specifically Sufi concepts, but I do this through a particularly Black Muslim lens. And again, when I use the term Black, I'm thinking capaciously that includes people of African descent around the world, right? So I start out with the first chapter is called Bay'ah. And for those of you that are familiar with this term, it tends to connote an oath of allegiance that gets uttered or performed or embodied that marks this sort of sacred pact between a sheikh and a student, or a murshid and a murid, right? Or talib. But I don't call it oath of allegiance or loyalty or fealty. I call it solidarity, right? Because I want to sort of lean away from the hierarchical relationship that tends to kind of that term tends to connote as people sort of translate that as oath of allegiance, right? The second chapter is zikr. I leave that as a remembrance, but it's not just a matter of remembering Allah. My argument is that if it's, as I believe it's Imam Ali has said, that to know oneself is to know one's Lord, surely to remember oneself is to know one's Lord, right? And then furthermore, in the context of this community, there's a certain manner in which the remembrance of Allah coincides with the reapprehension of the self, right? In which we can kind of come back to that perhaps. Ziyara is, I don't translate that as visitation, I translate it as movement, right? Trying to sort of ease out these sort of connotations of physical bodily movement that people engage in to go to visit Senegal, they're from South Carolina, or vice versa, to visit the maqam of Sheikh Mustafa, or to visit one's parents or anything else. Often the motives for that movement are sort of less highlighted in studies of Muslim migration. And so I want to talk about what motivates people moving from one side of the Atlantic to the other, and that is ziyada, right? A word that means effectively means expansion. And so I talk about bodily movement, but I talk about internal movement in order to do that. And then also there's a question of organizational movement as well that sort of folded into that. And the fourth chapter, Khidma, is one of my favorite chapters. I don't call it service, I call it labor, in order to talk about how, actually, I use this opportunity in this chapter to highlight the important roles that mothers have in the context of some Sufi traditions. Often when we think about the transmission of sacred knowledge that goes from one person to another, we assume that goes from male sheikh to male student or female student. But we often don't talk about the important mother work that happens in these communities that is responsible for the sort of ethical and spiritual formation of many of these visionaries, but then also the way in which their care literally holds these births and holds these communities together, right? And so I think about the transmission of sacred knowledge as necessarily being reproductive, hence the term labor. Mustafawiyya, whose picture I showed you earlier, who was responsible for the birthing of this community and its maintenance, she had, although she's retired now, she unremittingly, unceasingly cooked for the community for decades, right? Her profession was, she was a registered Black nurse midwife, right? Or a Black registered nurse and midwife, right? And so she used her midwifery skills to help sisters in the community, but then also her culinary labor to nourish people, right? All on land in a place where, again, in a prior context, those kinds of labor, that mother work and that culinary labor would have been extracted from her. And so that very same kind of labor would have been used to dehumanize people like her. In this context, it humanizes. And so one of the things I talk about in that chapter is the way that the role of mothers, right, or ummi, for example, or mothering on the context of the colony and the plantation, right, is one that debases Black women. But mother work and labor freely given in the context of the Zawiya, right, and the madrasa is something that elevates and humanizes, right? And this is a chapter I open talking about when I first learned, or I first hear Sheikh talking about his own mother, right? And he talks about her having memorized the Quran at the age of 9. And as a matter of fact, because she was the elder sister by 2 years of Sheikh Mustafa, the founder of the tradition, she helps her father, Sheikh Samba, Sheikh Qutb's grandfather, who was a renowned Quran teacher in Iran, Senegal. She actually winds up helping her younger brother start to learn the Quran, right? Who would then later, found this Sufi tariqa, right? And so as we talk about the transmission of sacred knowledge, I try to sort of place emphasis on mothering as, and we center mothering as an important component in the sort of ethical and spiritual formation of people. Pastia, I refer to as cultivation, and this is an opportunity to talk about a successive generation of Muslims who sort of take up the mission of the tariqa, right? And so, playing with that sort of agricultural language of labor cultivation. And then finally, Shifa, I don't actually translate it or call it healing, I call it repair, or rather reparations, right? Drawing on this both the spiritual and the political, making the argument that spirituality is never not political, right? Because the spirituality is always enacted through, embodied by, and performed by, through the body, right? Okay, so I wanted to just do this really quickly and then land this plane, this journey, right? As I was speaking with the third eldest son of Sheikh Mustafawiyya, so trying to, which I talk about at length in the 5th chapter, it's also something that was really, really interesting to me in terms of talking about how he feels about taking up this mission of the tariqa as his father got older, and he was, in Morocco at the time, studying and preparing himself to sort of then become the imam of the community, as he is now in Monk's Corner, in the wake of his father's passing last year. He said, heavy rock gets lifted from both sides. And so I use this proverb that he shared with me as a way to sort of think about a number of different things. One, to think about the way that the mission of the Vega requires people on both sides of the Atlantic to come together and kind of relying upon what Candace Watts Smith calls diasporic consciousness or pan-ethnic identity, Black pan-ethnic identity. But then also to think about sort of intergenerational, Professor Dustin, okay, I was gonna say, no, that's our vote. That is sort of the mission of the movement is something that requires a kind of intergenerational exchange, right? That the traditions, the protocols of a prior generation need necessarily be wedded to the commitment, the zeal, the energy, and I guess new strategies and tactics by a successive one, right? But then also, I also use this as an opportunity to think about the how one addresses and thinks about the addressing the ideology of race, right? Which is too often impressed upon the human being, right? I mean, the argument that colonial racial capitalism, or in other words, what I call in the book plantation modernity, is something that has desiccated the human. And what other that I think about Tasawwuf in the context of people of African descent as being, is answering the following question: what is the medicine for a poisonous idea, right? What is the medicine for a poisonous idea, right? If we are to address structural racism, right, isn't it perhaps appropriate to first address how it impacts the soul, right? And so as we talk about this skillful nafs, for those of us that are in sort of religious circles and Muslim circles, you have to think about the nafs as being something that is informed by having to overcome lower desires, greed, envy, arrogance, etc. But no one ever talks about how an ideology of race has impacted the us. Literally every human being on the planet practically has been racialized in some form or another. So how do we untether the human from an ideology of race is the question. And so I reflect on the people perhaps who are closest to Allah, who created the human being, perhaps know best among us. I also use this as an opportunity to kind of revisit the story of Sayyidina Bilal ibn Rabah, who is one of the companions of the Prophet, right? Probably the only Black companion that most Muslims know, but especially the ones in where I sometimes live in the United States. I say sometimes because I also just got my residency in Senegal, mashallah. But I'm not saying this don't work now. So I also talk about, so for those of us that are, familiar with the Surah of the Prophet Muhammad, so we know that as Sayyidina Bilal enters the story, he enters through this sort of moment of suffering, right? Primarily anyway, or this sort of pivotal moment in which the person who claimed to own him, Umayyad ibn Khalaf, took umbrage with Sayyidina Bilal's sort of spiritual and religious autonomy, right? In order to punish him, he tortures him by placing a heavy rock on his, he has him tied down in the hot sun, on hot sand, and places a heavy rock on his chest, or he orders his people to put a heavy rock on his chest. And so I think about how this sort of commitment to spiritual excellence and solidarity, or bay'ah, right, which is not just which is more than just a sort of relationship between a teacher and a student, but also a solidarity that can potentially exist and exists across cultural and ethnic lines, right, in which people come together for the sake of, bettering themselves before and as they seek to better humanity, right? It is the solidarity that the Prophet Muhammad, as well as Abu Bakr Siddiq, have with Bilal that winds up being part of the reason why that rock is lifted off the chest of Bilal, right? And Ibn Rabah. And so one of the things that I sort of try to urge readers to think about is, without that solidarity, this person that we hold up, that who's, the person who is the first person to be the first who in Islam, and through which whose words continue to call people to Islam, call people to success, call people to prayer to this day, 14 centuries later, right? Had that rock never been removed, perhaps we would never have those words, right? That then call us to be in communication with our Lord on a daily basis for those of us that pray, right? But then again, that sort of, there's another heavy rock that many of us are carrying around, and that is a rock that is placed on our hearts, right? And so how do we remove that rock is something that I sort of attempt to think about. All right, I'm going to skip over this part, or I'll just say, since you saw it already, you probably have questions. So this is a picture of Hassan, the third eldest son of Sheikh Qur'an, who is now Imam Hassan Fai, who cares for and is teaching in the community of Monk's Corner, where he spent much of his youth. He's on the streets of in Dakar protesting the former president's threats to run for a third term. And on the right, you see him protesting in support of the Palestinian liberation. And so I sort of use this as an opportunity in the book to kind of think about the Tasawwuf being more than just, I think against the sort of idea that the Tasawwuf is a mechanism for world denunciation and spirit and retreat, right? But rather is a means of engagement, right? That Black folks don't have the luxury of taking a back seat to our own liberation, right? All right, so essentially this is a book that is a reflection about West African Sufi ethics as a philosophy of freedom. I'm going to shut up now because I've been talking for a long time, and so hopefully we can have some discussion, inshallah. Thank you.
So thank you, Youssef. I had a lot of questions, but I will skip them. I'll just ask one question and open the floor for the conversation. So the question I have is about writing on grief. So there's a moving section that most share our in the book during the book's completion, and rather than sentimentalizing, you let grief clarify states. And the bath gifts are still available to give their breath, yeah. And the text preserves some of the intents, refers to the chef, or how he remains present in memory and practice. So my question is, how did reading, the reader of the book, shift the voice and the choices, and what were the ethical commitments that had those things, or how the grieving changed your writing?
You know, I'm gonna be crying about it. Because this is, I mean, so when the check passed, obviously I was broken, right? Still in, you know, I feel like there's a big hole that I'm like dealing with right now. Person, because he was my teacher. This is not just, you know, so this is, you know, for people who are looking for, you know, hundreds of pages of dry, academic rigorous writing, in the pursuit of some kind of distance, dispassionate, intellectual study of something that people hold to be sacred and quite personal. This is not that. I mean, even before the chef passed, as I was writing the book, because I wrote the majority of it before he passed, right? But even as I was writing the book, you know, 5 years ago, 7, I mean, it took me more than a decade to kind of, this journey has been more than a decade. There were moments where I was writing through while also weeping or trying to fight back tears because I write about my ancestors. I write about our ancestors. I write about people who try to sort of live out their deen, people who pray to their Lord with hands that are not considered that are considered the property of another person, right? So what does that mean to then to sort of write about that in a way that is dispassionate and cold, right? One of the things that I sort of try to think through in the opening chapter is a kind of an ethnographic, but then also political sensibility that informs my writing, which I refer to as bearing witness, right? And so to bear witness to something is not a matter of just retelling something, it's attesting to the veracity of something, right? That you have skin in the game, right? That you have a certain kind of testimony that you're willing to sort of offer up at the risk of your reputation, right? At the risk of your name, right? But then also for people who are familiar with the sort of Islam in a sort of Anglophone context, the words "I bear witness," right, are very much conversant with the Shahadatain. I bear witness that Allah is that there's no God but Allah. I bear witness that Muhammad is the messenger of Allah, sallallahu alaihi wasallam, right? And so I think of the work that I do here, but then also future work as well as a project of bearing witness, right? And I take that from two scholars, Biko Mandela Gray, who writes a book called Black Lives Matter, in which he's sort of engaging in a kind of reflection on the lives of Black folks who are murdered by the police, right? And what it means to kind of sit with their stories in a manner that's not just about a matter of retelling, but celebrating their lives and not just mourning their deaths, right? Of talking about the fact that they had families, right? That they're not just individuals, right? But also bearing the emotional, I don't say burden, but the emotional weight of sitting with what it means to write about, to reflect on, to allow these sort of examples of life stolen to have impact on you. And so I bear witness that in the book that, you know, that a project, a scholarly project that is bereft of emotional intelligence, I seek refuge from, right? I literally say that, I seek refuge from a scholarly project that is bereft of emotional intelligence, right? And so as far as the chef is concerned, I mean, it's still, it still hurts, obviously, but in spite of the fact that he was growing older. Somehow I never thought that I wouldn't be able to like put this in his hand. And I say that in the book. And so like I opened the book talking about the fact that like I'm because he passed away as I was preparing to like write acknowledgments. So I was like that far along in the manuscript. And so I was sort of trying to figure out, okay, so if I can't put this book in his hand, how do I show him gratitude, which is why I don't write acknowledgments. It's the title of the sort of collection of acknowledgments is Sugar, right? How do I thank him, right? And it's to talk about, to make it clear that this is a person, a human being, whose life commitment was to give all of what he had to bring people to Allah, right? To rescue people from or assist people on their journeys of religious education or Islamic education and spiritual expansion, right? Yeah.
So thank you, Youssef. Just very quickly, for the sake of all the scholars who are here, the PhD students, the professors, I think there's a question that you can probably help us to clarify. How have you been able to articulate scholarly work and a spiritual journey without trying to make a distance as a subject with your soul as a space of truth and knowledge? How are we able to bring that to the kind of writing in the academic space? Because most of the time in the social science, there is a kind of suspicion against the self, the subjectivity, etc., etc. And how and what is your secret and your methodology to be able to bring together all these two dimensions of the truth in one?
Yeah. Well, I don't know if it's necessary.
And how do you anticipate the perception of your methodology in the scholarly space?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. So I'm gonna give you the secret. So the secret is not to give a damn about what white folk think. I mean, that's just the secret. I did not write this book for the university, right? And granted, yes, I teach at a university, and inshallah, I'll cross the tenure line next year. Y'all pray for me because this is a courageous move, a bold move. But I wrote this book as an exercise, partly as an exercise in telling the story, a story about a community on its terms, and using the sort of the concepts and the language that the community uses in order to theorize about the community. One of the things that too many of us do, who are like disciplined by academia, is that we, for example, use the theory and language coming from a Eurocentric Enlightenment philosophy, or basically the thoughts of old white men who had some pretty jacked up ideas about people of African descent in the first place, and then talk about the inner lives of Black folks. For me, I don't know what to do that. I guess in a university, but I was not going to do that, right? There's no way, if the Sheikh had been alive, for me to be able to put this in his hand, having done that, right? But I also, so one of the things that I think is important to take seriously, right here, in the Quran, Allah says that indeed, God does not change the condition of a people until they first change what is in themselves, right? This is in Surah the 11th verse, right? Or the second half of the 11th verse. If we continue to use a racially capitalist, colonial epistemology to then think about freedom, you ain't never gonna be free. And I think it's as simple as that. Bad models lead to bad outcomes, right? And so I think for me, as other people have done, in the context of writing about the South in the context of the Black Atlantic, in terms of articulating how Islam, in the hands of people of African descent whose ancestors have either been enslaved or colonized or both, right? Being able to articulate how why Islam, from this particular vantage point, operates as, or Islam properly practiced, in my opinion, is actually an abolitionist praxis, right? It would be impossible to properly do that using someone else's language, particularly the language of people who don't know what a human being is actually, right? That have spent a lot of ink, a lot of time arguing that people of African descent are a lesser form of human being. Why would I ever look at them as the source for any kind of knowledge? Knowledge, properly understood, is something that benefits humanity. Something that investigates humanity is not knowledge, actually. And so, yeah, and, you know, yeah, and so, which is why the book, the process of writing the book is when I was in my Sufism class, I was trying to sort of find, I mean, granted, I can, you know, use the writings of Issue and whatnot, but, you know, these are college kids. And so, but then also I grew up in the 80s and 90s. And I think you'll appreciate that as a musician. I think one of the things that is very resonant with this is a song from Parliament. And it's entitled "Free Your Mind, Your Ass Will Follow." Sorry. And so if we don't liberate how we think, we're not going to liberate how we write. If we don't liberate how we write, we're not going to liberate hearts. If we don't liberate our hearts, we're never going to get free, right? And so I think it begins with that, right? Do you see yourself as a human being, or do you see yourself as, someone else's definition of a human being, right? So I think that is what sort of has informed my writing, and continues to inform my contentious relationship with the university, right?
So now I'm opening the floor to question and for everyone in English and in Spanish on the role of passing and
I can go here, we'll do it. Want to go?
Thank you so much for this contribution. I kind of have two questions, but I'm going to try to limit it to two. First, I wanted to hear more about your journey to this order. And then I was also struck by the diversity of the Black ethnics who are part of this order, the solidarity amongst them, and so I wanted you to elaborate a little bit more about that piece of it, and how they're able to maintain the solidarity across oceans, but also across these cultural differences.
So, as far as, so I first was introduced to this community in like 2007, 2008, when I was a graduate student in Durham, North Carolina. I was invited by a brother, actually interesting enough, who was a Black, he was a jazz musician, is a jazz musician, and he's Shia actually. And at the time, he was he was a student of the chef. So I went down with him to participate in the Eid al-Fitr program. And we went to Monks Point, South Carolina, which is a place that nobody moves to It's monks going like who's on up and moved amongst one in South Carolina, unless you are moving for the sake of being in proximity to the shack or living with this community. Those are the only people that up and moved amongst one in South Carolina. And so, and I talk about this, and I opened the first chapter talking about my journey to like being acquainted with this community and my own like wrestling with becoming a part of it, right? Because I came in with very like with a skepticism with regard to like the idea of being a teacher, right? For reasons I can talk about later, but just kind of my assumptions about like the potential for exploitation, these kinds of things, right? And so what I discovered was this community of mostly Black folk, sprinkling of like white folk in there, South Asians, but mostly Black folk, wearing three pieces, like boots and everything, matching kufi, manifest and everything, right? I even saw a little white kid, you know what I'm saying? Like he had to be like 8 years old with a book. I'm like, what is happening? Right? And it's something that just assaults the eyes. And not assault, but just like, I'm like, I need to know more. What is happening? But then also, I see this sort of, snazzily dressed, little African man on the stage talking about Islam. He is handing out like certificates of appreciation to the women of the community who have, taking care of the community, talking about the importance of expanding yourself, etc. And then he jokes about having slaughtered an elephant to serve to all the guests, right? Sense of humor. But there's just this huge sort of banquet of just, cornucopia of food that was that consists of like these southern comfort foods because we're in the South, as well as Senegalese food. And I'm like, oh, up to that point, I had never had Senegalese food, but on each plate I see Black Southern cuisine and West African food. And some of these places, like, you're not gonna eat all that. What are you doing? It was an interesting diasporic love affair on each plate, right? And the community itself was symbolic of this diasporic love affair of people from both sides of the Atlantic that begins with Sheffield and Afai and Umeshifai, right? I didn't know that at the time, but just my eyes took all of this in. And I'm trying, as someone who was, my mother was a seamstress growing up, and so I grew up in a Black Christian church, an AME church, and we had certain kind of sartorial customs that people were in big law, and kind of like a cliche fashion here and there. But I grew up reading about West Africa, etc. But I had never been to the continent until I went to Moncks Corner. And I make the argument that Moncks Corner is a kind of an introductory piece of West Africa that was recreated in that space, right? A space of refuge, a space of healing, a space of repair, right? The chef always referred to the masjid of Muhajirul Ansar as a hospital, right? And he meant that in a kind of a spiritual context, but it also meant that with sort of political realms. Like, what does it mean for people of African descent to then be reacquainted with, and in many cases married to people from West Africa, some of these folks, or Cote d'Ivoire, etc., Gambia, right? It does something different to you as someone who grows up in a family who great grandparents or whatever are from the continent. And what I mean by that is, for us, being African was more theoretical than actual, right? And so then, in terms of this question of solidarity, right? Being able to recite the writings of someone who is from Senegal, particular prayers that comes from someone who was from Senegal, as opposed to some booklet you get from, some printing press that comes out of Pakistan, or, some Arab stuff, right? And by Arab stuff, I'm not talking about language, we're talking about nationalism, right? Or cultural nationalism, Arab cultural nationalism. But this is very intentionally pro-Black. This is very intentionally African, right? Yeah, so I think that hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah.
Other thoughts, questions?
No, maybe a few words at the end, just to, but you may have other questions.
Questions?
Maybe,
Was I said clear? I was, I know there's some.
yeah.
Bonjour,
Ça va?
merci beaucoup. Moi, je vais parler français, parce que je suis beaucoup plus à l'aise. Donc, tout d'abord, vous remercier pour la présentation de votre livre et l'opportunité que vous nous faites de découvrir cette confrérie. Pour moi, je viens de connaître cette confrérie-là. Maintenant, ma question, c'est, ici au Sénégal, il existe d'autres confréries, à savoir la Tidjaniya, la Mouridia, etc. Je voudrais savoir, est-ce qu'il y a des influences ou bien des connexions entre cette confrérie-là et les autres confréries? Donc, c'est ça ma question. Ensuite, je voulais aussi que vous nous parliez un peu plus des pratiques. Par exemple, si on prend la Tariqa Tidjaniya, on sait que ils font les wazifas, les Khatam Juma, ainsi de suite. Ensuite, la pratique initiatique, vous avez parlé des secrets, etc. Comment la tarbiya, quoi. Donc, je ne sais pas si c'est les mêmes pratiques avec cette confrérie-là. Merci.
Yes.
Yes, so it is not like greeting you for your presentation and the opportunity to discover another brotherhood, the Sufi brotherhood here in Senegal, to Mustafawiyya. And the question I ask you is here in Senegal, we have other brotherhoods, the Tijaniya, the Mouridia, etc. So we find links between those brotherhoods and the Mustafawiyya or influence first. And if you want to know more about the spiritual practices of the Mustafawiyya, so the Tijaniya have specific practices, etc. And what are the spiritual practices of the Mustafawiyya that are related to?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. So as far as one of the reasons why I named the book The Vast Oceans, because I don't make the argument that the Mustafawiyya is exceptional. I'm making the argument that the Tijaniya is also the Qadariya, the Muridiyya, and the Layan actually, and others that arise and emerge out of Senegal, for example, right? An environment that has known colonization, in which one could argue colonialism isn't entirely over, right? That these Sufi movements are doing something, right? Spiritually, but then also politically, right? And I was having this conversation with a colleague not too long ago, in which one of the consequences of growing up in an environment where you are so surrounded by and immersed in an environment like this is that you don't often get to see and reflect on how special it is, right? When we are so but if we are somehow, divorced from the founder, right? And the kinds of overt expressions of how and why these movements are initiated. It's easier to sort of misinterpret them as purely spiritual, right? Or maybe the better way to say that is to misinterpret the purpose of religion as being entirely motivated by questions of the spirit and not questions of the body, right? Islam is not, and this is one of the things that comes through, Islam is not merely only concerned with who you are internally, right? It also concerns your freedom, right? Which is why throughout the Quran, there are messages about freeing people, right? What does it mean to pray, but then not to feed people, actually? And for example, in in Surah Al-Ra'd, right, in the 28th ayah, it talks about the importance of that, if I can remember correctly, I'm gonna have to look this up. Drawing a blank. It talks about remembrance of Allah, right? That hearts find comfort in the remembrance of Allah, right? And so throughout the 28th ayah. The very next ayah talks about beautiful deeds, right? And so I think about this as a sacred order of operations in certain ways. And so it's a message about changing what is in yourself so that you can change your condition, right? It doesn't say change what's in yourself, and then Allah is gonna, change your condition, and then the internal movement is optional, right? It's that there's one that has to precede the other in a certain kind of way. But as far as the practices that are concerned, they're very resonant because they come from the same source, actually, right? And the source is not a sheikh, the source is Allah, right? And Nabi Muhammad, right? One of the things that's interesting is the people, these very special, these awliya, these very special people who are connected to Allah, who all have a relationship with Nabi Muhammad, right? Who visits them in their dreams or during a waking encounter that gives them license to initiate these movements, right? Which are initiated for the sake of moving people collectively on a journey to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, right? And so, yes, there's a Mustafawiyya, there's a Hadr al-Juma, etc., right? And practices that are very resonant, that are designed to uplift the human being, right? That are designed to expand one's heart, that are designed, and as well, and just in the Jamia tradition and just in the Muradiyya tradition, right? You have commitments to religious education, but then also spiritual practices, etc. Right? So they're very resonant. As a matter of fact, the Sheikh Saba, the father of Sheikh Mustafa, was Tijani. Right?
Tu peux ajouter un mot. Vous avez parlé de... Ah oui, d'accord, ok. Allez,
donc, il dit qu'en fait, le fait qu'il ait appelé le livre de Vast Ocean, c'est pour relever le fait que la Mustafawiyya n'est pas spécifique, singulière et exceptionnelle. Elle est en relation avec les autres traditions spirituelles et soufis. Donc, il vient définir le fait que Cheikh Moustapha, le fondateur de la communauté, était idéal lui-même avant de donner l'investiture spirituelle à Cheikh Aaron Fay. Et que généralement, il y a un biais spiritualiste qu'on n'a pas le conflit soufi. Lorsqu'on est trop proche, on oublie qu'il y a une dimension sociale et politique ensuite. Changer ce qu'il y a en soi, changer sa condition. Donc la vie a la propre séquentialité et que le travail spirituel, il n'a pas juste pour but la spiritualité pure, il a une connotation et une implication politique. Et d'ailleurs, il dit que bien évidemment, il y a des thématiques spécifiques. Il y a une prière en wird, Mustafawiyya, il y a un travail du Juma comme chez les Tidianes, et il fait le lien de linéaire entre la Tidiane et la Mustafawiyya, du fait du fondateur de la confrérie soufie. Mais il insiste sur le fait que l'islam n'est pas juste pour lui un chemin spirituel pour une fin purement spirituelle. Donc le chemin spirituel est un moyen de changement social et politique.
Voilà, ce que je voudrais ajouter, c'est apprécier ce qu'il a dit par rapport au fait de se sentir à l'aise par rapport à un islam où vous voyez un peu la dimension africaine en quelque sorte. Et c'est très important parce qu'on a beau dire, mais l'islam n'est pas, ou toute religion a nécessairement sa dimension humaine. Et se retrouver dans la religion à partir de certains visages, de certaines figures, est extrêmement très important parce qu'il faudrait que votre moi-même puisse épouser la religion pour que vous vous sentiez là-dedans. Je me rappelle ce livre de Genovese, Roll Children Roll, The World was Slave Made. Il y a une anecdote. Un propriétaire blanc qui va à l'église et qui amène son esclave, disons qu'il s'appelle John. Mais avant de partir, il sermonne John, parce que John, quand il va à l'église, Dès que ça commence à faire chaud et il sent qu'il y a la même temps, immédiatement il commence à crier. C'est un peu l'église gloire aux États-Unis, Peach, brother, Peach, et il y a une certaine réchauffement. Alors, on y va et il dit à John, cette fois-ci, il ne faut pas que tu cries, il ne faut pas que tu danses. Si tu ne cries pas et tu ne danses pas, quand tu reviendras, I'm going to offer you a pair of boots. Je vais te donner une paire de chaussures toutes neuves. Ils y vont et la salle s'échauffe et le prêtre, et John saute et crie. Et il dit, boots or no boots, I'm going, yeah, it's not very, boots or no boots, I'm going to holler. Effectivement, il crie, c'est ça, il sent ça. Mais il y a aussi certaines expressions dans nos confréries, c'est d'ailleurs toutes les confréries. Là, nous l'aimons, on le fait entendre, mais là, vous êtes en communion véritablement physique et spirituelle et avec la religion. Et c'est extrêmement important. Et les confréries au Sénégal donnent justement ce cachet-là. Et c'est dommage que ceux qui disent les confréries, c'est pas la religion, ne voient pas ce lien ombilical extrêmement important. D'ailleurs, il y a une adaptation dont il ne parle jamais et qui est là est essentielle. Je dirais, pour l'islam africain et ouest africain et en particulier sénégalais, rien ne se fait sans la cola. Or, la cola ne vient pas d'Arabie Saoudite. L'Arabie Saoudite a interdit que les pèlerins viennent avec les colas parce qu'ils mâchouillent et après ils s'assurent sur les mixeurs déjà. Mais vous ne pouvez rien faire sans amener le courroux. Si vous voulez vous marier, il faut que vous ameniez la cola. Symboliquement et concrètement, il y a des colas qu'on donne aux gens. Dans d'autres cérémonies religieuses à la mosquée, vous n'avez pas la cola, rien ne se fait. Mais c'est très simple. Nous, on n'est pas le peuple des dates. Les dates, on les a adaptées ici, mais ça ne marche pas très bien. Il suffit d'aller en Tunisie et voir les vergers avec les dates. Vous savez qu'on n'a rien ici. Mais prendre la cola et la cola dans son sens africain du terme. Parce que la cola est tout long, c'est deux parties. Scellée par la nature. C'est pour ça que votre ami, vous l'appelez Harit Mamoitié. Et c'est l'image de la cola qui est toujours 2 ou 3 lots que vous les partagez. C'est ça, le mot, c'est en relation avec ça. Un fruit qui a une symbolique aussi forte et aussi positive, on l'introduit dans la religion ici. Mais c'est la meilleure des choses possibles. On n'a rien à dire. Donc, je crois que c'est une très bonne chose qu'il ait voulu voir cette dimension très africaine, j'allais dire même très nègre, dans la religion. Parce que la religion, si on lui donne un caractère universel, à partir de jour, ça n'appartient pas spécifiquement à une culture particulière. Quand on était étudiant en France, il y a un de mes amis qui parle à une Française et lui dit, je suis musulman. Alors la Française qui ne connaît rien lui dit, mais tu n'es pas arabe. Comme quoi il faut être arabe pour être musulman. Bon, donc vraiment, apprécier cette conversation-là et ce que ça nous apporte quand même par rapport à la religion et par rapport à l'Afrique. Merci beaucoup.
Il y a le prof qui répond à la parole.
Ah oui, d'accord. Même si elle ne demande pas, vous avez besoin de la parole. D'accord, voilà.
C'est dommage, j'étais sortie parce que je devais parler de Champions. Elle m'a retrouvé un peu. Et je suis intéressée, très intéressée par la question, par la présentation. Et moi, je me suis posé un certain nombre de questions. Peut-être même vous y avez répondu, il faudra lire le livre. Comment il a été le moment de la connexion entre lui et le Seigneur. Et l'attitude des autres familles religieuses par rapport à lui, c'est-à-dire, est-ce qu'il n'a pas été contesté, est-ce qu'il n'a pas été vu comme un hérétique? Comment ces familles ont réagi par rapport à lui? Parce que je connais le fondateur de la mosquée de la divinité, Tout à fait, au début, c'était pas facile, avocat. Les appels de Allah, Allah. Il y en avait un qui faisait Allah, Allah, qui a été persécuté. Moi-même, j'ai travaillé sur une femme qui a essayé de créer sa propre voix Sufi, il y a une et on l'a appelée la prophétesse, etc. Et elle a été au début. On disait effectivement, les gens croyaient en elle, mais vers la fin, elle a été traitée de shaitan, etc. À partir du moment où on sort un peu de ces familles qui sont connues, ou bien de ces confréries qui sont établies, on n'est pas toujours très bien perçu. Et c'est vrai aussi, même aujourd'hui, les Layènes qui sont ici dans la région de Dakar, on les accepte aujourd'hui, mais il y a eu surtout lorsqu'ils envoyaient au martyr en général. Et il y a eu beaucoup de problèmes comme ça. Et beaucoup de rivalité dans le milieu sud. On le voit d'ailleurs en ce moment où Ahmed Khalifa s'attaque à Tiwawan et la journaliste et les réponses. Ça veut dire qu'il y a eu toujours, et c'est pas nouveau, c'est pas un phénomène nouveau, on le voyait entre les Nyassènes et les Tidianes de Tivaouane. À un moment donné, c'est aujourd'hui seulement qu'on commence à dire qu'il y en a un que j'ai écouté il y a 2 jours, qu'il a vu un rêve, comment il s'appelle, Niass, le chef, et qui lui a expliqué dans le rêve que El Hadji Malick Sy est un peu la porte de toutes ces confréries, de la Tijaniya. Et puis, il y a toujours eu une lutte pour celui qui contrôle la Hijada, celui à qui Cheikh Ahmed Tijan Chérif a désigné comme son représentant. Il y a toujours eu ces rivalités, ces problèmes. Et je ne sais pas, parce que pour la première fois, moi, en tant que Sénégalaise, intéressée par ces questions que j'entends vraiment parler de ces Cheikh et de sa voix. Donc, comment il a été perçu, ça m'intéresse beaucoup. Et aujourd'hui, qu'en est-il de cette voie? Et beaucoup, par exemple, les Cheikh Taïou Doucouré, qui étaient là dans la région de Dakar, il était très, très puissant du temps du président Senghor, les premiers moments, mais après, il a été un peu évincé. Je crois que le fait de l'avoir évincé, derrière, d'après ce qu'il m'a expliqué, il y avait la France, mais aussi, il n'était pas, comme il était analyste, il n'était pas véritablement dans les confréries, disons, les Tijaniya ici, acceptés, etc. Et c'est toujours ce qui continue comme lutte entre les différentes familles. Moi, j'aimerais bien savoir comment il a été perçu et comment il a fait pour développer sa voix sans qu'il y ait ce type de réaction, s'il n'y a pas de réaction. Merci. Et puis, dernière chose, vous l'avez évoqué tout à l'heure, c'est-à-dire le rôle de la femme, sa sœur. Et ça, c'est une permanence. On trouve ce rôle chez lui, on trouve ce rôle chez les mourides avec Manga Rousseau, d'autres femmes. Alors là, c'est une voix, quelque chose qui m'intéresse beaucoup. Merci. Vous avez compris?
Yes. So maybe the question is how Chef Arolete was able to open a new path and being accepted with that of opening a new path. So she's a historian of Islam, and she witnessed that when the male brotherhood is established with authority, it's difficult for a new path to open. And sometimes there is contestation. There are also rivalry between the military class. And did it happen with Shahar at the beginning? And she witnessed a lot of new paths that at the beginning were very difficult to establish. And some of them became established later on and had to be able to just sit there authority. So is there a story like that? And she also wanted you to just highlight the role of the woman, the sister or the wife, as you did in the establishment of the territory. She's very interested in how Aaron was able to break this new path, and now where are we? Is the path established? Is there a conversation or not? Is the difficulty figure out to embrace or not?
Yeah, so thank you for the question, Professor. I feel like I don't deserve to be. I feel like our places should be switched, so I'm very much honored to sit in your presence, inshallah. Because I know who you are, so and I'm familiar with all of the sort of scholarship that you've done. And so as far as that Sheikh Mustafa is concerned, who was the founder of the Tariqa, he wasn't the kind of Sheikh who was very prominent. He was very much in his house, and so the knowledge that he had came to him based on his efficacy, based on what he was able to do for them, based on the knowledge that he unfolded for them. And so really it's due to the efforts of Sheikh Nafai that really spreads the Tariqa in a particular kind of way, honestly speaking. And as far as the Sheikh is concerned, he was not someone who explicitly, I mean, you know, he definitely sort of taught people about the Tariqa, people who were wanting to come into it, but he was not someone who necessarily put himself as exceptional explicitly in public before others. Right? The way that he taught was that, you know, multiple roads can lead to a place. This is one of those roads, right? This is a particular vehicle that Sheikh Mustafa conceived of as to bring people to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And furthermore, their validity is not by virtue of the validity of the Mustafawiyya, and the validity of others is not by virtue of the people who found it, or the validity necessarily of the people who follow, but rather the validity of the mechanism itself in terms of its commitment to and its being informed by the Quran, the Sunnah, the Sharia, as well as the kinds of the spiritual dimensions of the you know, this sort of scholarly tradition, or in the silsila of each of these particular traditions. So, for example, one of Sheikh Qaroor's childhood friends was the Lion, right? And you know, every time he would come to Senegal, especially when people come to you know, he would bring people to Senegal from the United States. One of the Jummahs that we would go to is the Jummah of the Grand Mosque of Camberen, because he really loved the zikr there. Right? So much so that that's my favorite. You know, one of the first times I came to the Senegal with the Sheikh, he brought us to Camberen, right? And then, you know, so we would sit there, and then the zikr just kind of, or anybody who's never been there before, you should go. But the zikr just moves through you in this kind of way. And then we would have lunch in the house of, you know, his childhood friend, who's like an uncle to me, basically, who also then came to read the Quran for the Sheikh after when he passed. When he was in the United States, this is before he met the Sheikh, but there's a picture of him with Minister Louis Farrakhan, right? Which is, you know, the leader of another Muslim movement that is based in the United States that arguably sort of sits in that sort of category that others sit in, that have been described as quasi or actually heretical or what have you, or sort of where my point is that the validity gets questioned about them, but the idea is to sort of find the camaraderie, particularly with regard to people who are committed to virtuous, righteous people who are committed to bringing people to Allah, and committed to a particular kind of a humanist understanding of Islam, right? I wanted to say something really quickly. So when I was with Umrah, there was I went several years ago, and there was a young brother there who was, I think he's South Asian. And for some reason, we were at dinner, and he starts talking to the group about him sort of questioning the existence of Allah, right? Very curious fellow, part of our Umrah group, but nonetheless, he's there. And so I sort of read this and receive this as very peculiar, but then I have a very sort of specific memory of being in front of the Kaaba in my ihram, and along the journey, he wrestles with himself, and he winds up sitting right next to me, to my right, also wearing his ihram, and he's also similarly staring at the Kaaba and weeping. And that was a very sort of interesting moment that I shared during one of our meetings that we had in the Tariqa in South Dakota and in Dakar. When the Sheikh was there, the son of Sheikh Mustafawiyya there, he's the Khalifa of the Tariqa, Sheikh Mohammed Saleh. Anyway, the reason I bring this up is to say, as I said to the people there, is that, I've been kind of thinking up to this point, up to that point, in a country that's about 95% Muslim, and the 95% of those Muslims are probably or affiliated with one or more tariqa, what is the motive for establishing yet another tariqa, another movement, right? This is a question that I think is inside of the question that you have. In a place where most people are Muslim, we can kind of take Muslimness for granted in a certain kind of way. But faith, belief, actually, is not something that can be taken for granted, which is why I brought up that story. And so these movements are things that are designed to inspire and enliven people's faith, right? And that's what they do. Effectively, they're vehicles for the establishment and the rootedness of an iman that can live in the heart beyond just ritual practices, right? How do you come to be sort of reacquainted with and reintroduced to who you are by virtue of who created you, right? As opposed to an understanding of yourself that is very much manufactured externally, as a project of trying to build in a vision of God that is white, right? And so this is a mechanism that is designed to destroy this idea that white people are more than human, and that people of African descent or Black people are less than human, right? That it reinforces a kind of a repair that's necessary in terms of thinking about the human. That in fact there is a hierarchy to be respected, but the only hierarchy with respect to humanity is between creation and that which created it, right? Other questions?
Peut-être professeur Barry, je ne sais pas, Boubacar Barry, je ne sais pas s'il a un ou deux mots à ajouter.
Moi, j'ai beaucoup appris. Je pense que l'islam se confond avec notre histoire depuis les millénaires et elle va continuer elle aussi à être un des facteurs les plus importants de l'évolution de l'Afrique de l'Ouest. Et ça continue et je pense que nous assistons aujourd'hui au passage de l'Atlantique Est à l'Atlantique Ouest. J'ai vu beaucoup de jeunes noirs américains venir dans les daras pour s'instruire auprès des marabouts, que ce soit Mustafawiyya, que ce soit comment s'appelle encore celui de Kaolack. Hassan, et j'ai vu Hassan fonctionner avec son groupe nord-américain. Il venait 6 mois ici avec leurs enfants pour s'instruire, pour s'imprégner de l'islam. C'est dire que c'est comme ça qu'il y avait une interruption. Parce que la plupart des musulmans qui ont traversé l'Atlantique pendant l'esclavage, ce sont eux qui ont fait la révolte de Bahia depuis le siècle. Et donc, il y avait un va-et-vient, c'était accentué et qui se poursuit maintenant. Et je suis très heureux de voir notre collègue à la fois s'inspirer de prendre en main la spiritualité que l'islam nous apporte et en même temps la diffusion de connaissances par rapport à son maladie. En tout cas, félicitations et continuons. Merci.
So, Professor Gundua Cabre, he's an historian, and he said that the movement from the Atlantic is now from the east to the west, and then constant movement between the two styles from east to west and west to east. And he there's a lot of Black folks, Black Americans that came to Senegal and instruct themselves to share values, as I said, and it was an ongoing travel to the 2000s and the 19th century. It was the Black Muslim enslaved that lead the revolution in the 19th century. Yes, and this movement is very happy that you came here and share your journey through this book and just remarkable contribute this movement and West Africa. So yes, and vice versa.
Well, thank you so much.
Yes, yes.
But
Continue. We're gonna wrap up.
Oh, I didn't even say something.
Yes.
Thank you so much. And again, I'm honored that you all would sit with me to hear about the work that I've done. I see this as a khidmah for my sheikh, yes, for my community, yes, but just for humanity. And as you asked the question before about in terms of scholarly writing, right? There's a matter of fact, I'm gonna do this. I'm gonna end with a quote from, if I can, from Sheikh Ibrahim Yas, who was so one, I have a couple of colleagues. One is Professor Zachary Wright, who teaches at Northwestern University of Qatar, who wrote an article about how Sheikh Ibrahim Yas was a Pan-Africanist, right? But then also another colleague who recently wrote a book called Black Muslim Freedom Dreams. Her name is Dr. Samiha Rahman, which talks about the story of African-American Tijanis who find solace and community in Medina Bay, right? And are part of this network that we highlighted in terms of the sort of circulation of believers on both sides of the Atlantic, right? I'm not sure, maybe my connection won't allow me. But there's a quote by Sheikh Ibrahim Yas that talks about the importance of young intellectuals. I actually have to pull it up on our website for the organization that I started actually with some colleagues called Aisha, the Africana Islamic Social Sciences and Humanities Association, which arises and informs the conference we did last year in Dakar at the Museum of Black Civilizations. Yeah. So this is in the 1960s, Sheikh Ibrahim Yas wrote, or at least spoke the following. He says, "For the youth, I thank you all for your papers, and I'm here to tell you to go ahead and be in the vanguard of things. Surely the future of every nation is based on its youth, but it is not based upon all of them, not upon every individual, but only on the intellectual ones, the educated ones with good character, good manners, and zeal. And as for the youth lacking education and good character, he is like a seed unfertilized. So make every effort to seek and do your best to acquire more knowledge, not only Islamic knowledge, not only mathematics and its branches, but also be part of and cooperate with those whose zeal is to discover the unknown and unseen things of this world." So I understand that as a clarion call for a message and a calling for those of us who, for whatever reason, Allah has blessed with the opportunity to write, to publish, to reflect, the privilege of being able to, make our livelihoods by these endeavors. And it would be, I think, blasphemous to publish, write things that are inconsequential, things that are not informed by the moving of our hearts, such that they move the hearts of others toward what is good, toward what is righteous, toward what is we can see as sort of a project of freeing the human being from its prisons of misunderstanding, of racism, of colonialism, of consumerism, etc. So Once again, thank you so much for listening. I would like to shake everybody's hand, so please allow me to do that. Thank you.
Donc, merci au WARC